Good evening, everybody. Happy Independence Day to all. Welcome to the Karwaan Conversations. I am Ishan Sharma, founder of Karwaan. And with me today, this evening, I have a very special guest, Kavita Puri, joining us from the UK, hopefully from London. And today we are going to talk about something that is often not talked about that much in mainstream history writing and in our memories of the independence, the partition that followed, the violence that followed, and the price of freedom that Hindustan, paid in 1947. The loss of lives of more than 2 million people and 14 million people uprooted from their roots, migrated to alien lands where they had nobody related to them, or they had no mean of living, and some of them migrated to the Britain. So today we are going to talk about some untold uh, stories from the Britain of the partition. People who migrated from India and then Pakistan to the Britain, to the UK. And welcome, Kavita. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation for
Thank
being
you.
a guest.
Thank you, Ishana. Thank you so much for having me.
I'll quickly introduce you, though you do not need an introduction. Kavita is an award-winning journalist, executive producer, and broadcaster for the BBC. She is also the author of the critically acclaimed book that you can see in the background, Partition Voices, Untold British Stories. She's a regular presenter of the Inquiry on the BBC World Service and Radio 4. She devised and presented the landmark three-part series, Partition Voices, on Radio 4, marking the 70th anniversary of the partition of India. Today, okay, so I'll start with the question, Kavita, about the show that you did for Radio 4, the Partition Voices. Yeah. How did it come to you? Why did you thought to do such a show?
Well, the 70th anniversary was approaching, and I was very aware that well, first, I suppose it begins in my own family. And as with so many people who write about partition, it is a very personal story. And in my family, my dad lived through partition, and it was something he found very difficult to talk about. I had gently tried to approach him and ask him about it, and he didn't really want to speak about it. And as the 70th anniversary came up, I felt very strongly that that generation that lived through it, like my dad, that if we didn't record their stories, they would be lost forever. And so I wanted to collect stories, but within Britain, of people who had lived through partition, because a lot of people who came here were actually people who had come from the places that were most disrupted by partition. But within families in Britain, actually, a lot of British South Asians don't even know that much about partition because people didn't talk about it. But also within Britain, people don't talk about it. We don't learn about it in school. We don't learn about empire in school. So there was a kind of silence upon silence, really. And so I did a kind of call out to people. I didn't want to approach interviewees. And once we started looking, we realized these stories of people who had witnessed partition, people who had grown up under empire and had seen its demise. These stories were all around us in Britain, British South Asians, but also British colonial or former British colonial people too. And so I really wanted to document these stories before it was too late. And so that's what I did with my radio series.
Would you be comfortable sharing your father's story, how he came to the UK and Britain?
So my dad came in 1959 to Britain, but he was born in Lahore and spent 12 years of his life there. But then when partition became a reality, he left to go to Moga. His family were very lucky. My family were very lucky. They all, apart from my grandfather, left in June 1947 to go and live with my great-grandparents who lived in Moga. But they didn't know whether Moga would be in Pakistan or in India. And so they had prepared for the 17th of August when the announcement was made to leave. They'd prepared a suitcase. things were very bad in Lahore when he left, and they really left for his elder sister was 15, and I think they were worried about her. And he then witnessed terrible things that he never really talked about until the kind of last months of his life. And he saw murders of mothers and their children in front of them, the murder of kind of young Muslims. And he was very distressed by it. He was very distressed at the age of 12. He took to sleeping with his dad. He was so scared. But it was something he never talked about. But it was only after my radio program actually went out that he then did talk about his stories. He was a bit upset that I hadn't included his story in my radio programs, and I said, but you never told me. But I think he felt, on hearing other people's stories, he wasn't alone. And it's something I found with partition survivors. They think, they think many things, but they think their story is not worthy of telling. It's just a small story, it's a footnote. But I think they didn't want to burden future generations either. They didn't want to poison their minds in any way. They just wanted to look ahead. But of course, the point about partition and witnessing trauma is that even if your father or your grandparents don't talk about it, you still feel it. It still gets passed down the generations. So I'm very glad my dad did eventually tell me his story, but I still think there are things he didn't tell me. And now I will never know, because all the siblings who lived through partition have now passed away. So those stories have now gone.
Yes, but it's interesting to see the transition from being subjects of the British Raj to being citizens of.
Sorry.
I think, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes. So it's interesting to see that, being a subject of the British Raj to being a citizen in a British country, in Britain. A story from the book that I really I won't say enjoyed it, but really touched my heart was the story of Bashir Ahmed Mann from Scotland, and his story, and where you have written that nobody anticipated what would happen, the violence. Nobody could have anticipated that this much violence would take place. They were supportive of the idea of Pakistan in the beginning, but then they regretted their decisions. How do you see that? Is this a very common thing with all the stories?
What I've learned, Ishan, honestly, is that there are things that are common, but everybody had a different view. So some people, he fought for an independent Pakistan, and it wasn't then. In Bashir's case, it wasn't the country he thought it was, and that's why he took the decision to emigrate to Scotland. But other people, Raj Daswani, wanted independence, but didn't think that independence would mean that he, a Hindu, would have to leave Sindh province. But then there are other women, there are other people. There's a woman I'm particularly thinking of who was forced to leave Delhi and felt that actually partition was the right thing. So people have very, very different views, but what they have in common is they still feel very attached to the land that they left. And even though they witnessed terrible things, they still wanted to tell me stories of goodness, of people transcending religion to help the people of the other religion.
It is more or less like what Faiz Ahmad Faiz wrote ki ye daag daag uzala ye shab gazida seher इंतजार था जिसका ये वो शहर तो नहीं. This is not the dawn that that was promised to us. This is not that promise of a Muslim state, a happy Muslim state, where all would feel equals, and there would be prosperity. So in the beginning of Pakistan, the initial years were very tough, and I think that even Bashir said that was the time when he decided that he won't be able to live there. So coming to the human stories, do you think these stories influence the narrative of the partition, the scholarly narrative of the partition, and they too does have a role to play?
I absolutely think it does. I mean, if you look at, one of the greatest traumatic events of the 20th century, the Holocaust, you would never imagine the study of the Holocaust without the study of the lived experience. And I think that so much of the history of partition has been seen through the prism of, the high politics, so through civil servant accounts or through politicians' accounts. And it wasn't until really the late 90s, or the 90s, with Urvashi Bhattalia's seminal work, The Other Side of Silence, which documented the oral history of women, that oral history came into the prominence. And there are so many complicated reasons for that, because people weren't ready to speak. And in Britain, people weren't ready to speak until 70 years after the event. So, you have to capture these stories, as I always say, because once they're gone forever. And some of the recollections may be, of course, they might be imperfect. And it's important to recognize that we're recording these stories 70 years on. But if you look at what they're saying, the detail of what they're saying, it always surprised me, the clarity with which my elderly interviewees remembered that time. And so I think that when you're looking at the overall history of partition, you absolutely have to also include those oral testimonies, because look at the statistics. The statistics are staggering and overwhelming. 1 million people dead, up to 14 million people on the move, thousands, tens of thousands of women abducted. But otherwise, you look at this as statistics. It's not statistics. Look at one story, how one story changes one life, one family, and then the subsequent generations. We need to hear these stories too.
I'll come to the partition in a while, and I'll take you to the question of decolonizing the British curriculum of history,
Yeah.
where partition and the freedom struggle of India and their domain, the Commonwealth nations, are not much talked about. But there are debates in the House of Commons and House of Lords about decolonizing the curriculum. How do you see that as a journalist?
Well, I follow those debates quite avidly, and I think that we are going through in Britain a really interesting moment, where the history of the people from the former colonies and their descendants, and those descendants are asking for their history to be recognised as British history. And I feel quite strongly that if you don't understand the history of empire, you don't understand the demise of the British Empire, you then don't understand the migrations that happened to Britain. You don't understand why I'm in Britain. You don't understand why contemporary Britain looks the way it does today. So the last census, which happened 10 years ago, shows up to 3 million British South Asians. That's a huge number. The latest census will show even more. We are part of the fabric of Britain. Our connections go back 400 years. And I'm very clear that decolonizing the curriculum should not be about blame. It should be for British South Asians to understand their history, which, by the way, they don't, but also for British people to understand why British South Asians are here. And it is a deep connection. And people have been here from the British, British South Asians have been here. South Asians have been here for many hundreds of years in Britain. Of course, before the Second World War, that the presence was quite small, and the numbers grew afterwards, after the British Nationality Act said that everybody who was part of the empire was automatically a British citizen. But I also think it matters for the cohesion of British society. And so I do hope that in my lifetime that we see all British school children learning about partition, but also in the context of empire. But that is not the case at the moment.
Yes, and coming back to the partition, you said the memories of partition are still etched on everyone's memory so clearly and vividly. Do you think those narratives are often maybe colored with some bias of their own towards a particular community because of what they went through? Do you think that trauma
Actually,
have colored their narrative?
I think that what surprised me, and I didn't know what I would find once I started on this project, what surprised me was how people, of course, they witnessed horrors, And they talked about that. But they were also at pains to tell me 70 years on of all the good acts that people took to save them, or good things that they witnessed. They wanted that recorded. They wanted recorded the deep friendships they had, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, that they, the thing that they missed was seeing their friends or not being able to say goodbye. And the attachment to the land that they had lived on, but their parents had lived on, their grandparents. There were long histories in the so-called other country, and they felt that very profoundly. So what I would say was, it wasn't the trauma that they recalled, it was that attachment to the land. So I would ask my interviewees, where do you feel you belong? And they would say, well, the place that I was born, the place that I moved to on the Indian subcontinent, and Britain. And one interviewee, Iftikhar Ahmed, who moved from Delhi to Lahore, said to me, but India was mine as well. My mother is buried in India's earth. And equally, my another interviewee would say, I went back to Karachi, and I took the dust, I put it to my head and said, Mother, I have come home. And he keeps pebbles from Karachi in his study, which he touches and says, I feel connected to my soil. And so we have to listen to these when people want to kind of talk about the horrors. Yes, horrors happen, but that generation remember a time of undivided India where people largely did get along together, and more than that, had deep friendships where language and food and tradition and culture really bound you together in a way that it wasn't always about religion. They remember that time, and when that generation has gone, it worries me that we will forget that, because what I think has happened is that perhaps subsequent generations have a much hardened attitude to the other countries.
Yes, and while reading your book and while reading other scholarly works on partition, what I have gathered is, during the talks of partition, during discussing the partition plan around June 1947, both Jinnah and Nehru said what they did not mean, and did what they did not want, and asked for what they did not even think about, like partition. Do you agree with this kind of complex relation and maybe complex reasons that culminated to partition? Like Jinnah might not have wanted a separate state, but something else. How do you see the reasons for partition as a
I
scholar?
mean, my work was really interviewing people. I didn't do a kind of scholarly work on the causes of partition. I think they're probably better historians to ask than me. I think that I think the causes of partition are incredibly complex, but I think it's significant that the discussions when Mountbatten came in March, and the decision was taken on the 3rd of June, it was quite a short time, but it was taken against a huge increase in violence in northern India, particularly the Punjab. And I think that must have greatly influenced the decision for partition, but also significantly, it must have influenced the decision of Mountbatten to move forward that transfer date from June 1948 to the 15th of August 1947, leaving it only 10 weeks to divide the nation.
Yes. Coming to the partition stories again, how was your first experience of recording the stories? It must be traumatic for you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like, it was traumatic for my interviewees to talk about it, to be honest, and I could see that it was traumatic for them. They felt a kind of pull in both directions. Often they were saying the words for the very first time out loud. Sometimes family members in the room were hearing the stories for the first time. They would pause. I could see on their face it was very difficult for them. I would ask them to stop. I would ask them not to speak if they didn't want to. They didn't have to tell me all their feelings at that moment. But I also felt a pull in the other direction, which was to put on record what they had been through, but also they were happy that somebody had asked them, because often people didn't ask. Maybe family members didn't even know. So, you know, I always want to say that they went through the biggest trauma in having to retell the story. And I did wonder sometimes if it was right for me to even ask people to do that, because I could see the toll it took. But of course, for me, and I wasn't thinking about it at the time, it was only towards the end, after I'd finished all my interviews, that I kind of, you know, it took a toll on me, because these are very, very heavy testimonies to hear day in, day out. And, you know, I will never forget the things that I heard. I'll never forget the way that people spoke and told me their stories. And you know, that will live with me now for the rest of my life.
That's true. And even reading the book that you have written, Partition, even I cried for many nights after reading some of the stories. They were very
Yeah.
personal, and I think all of us should read these books. And in particular, your book and Anchal Malhotra's book on
Yes.
partition, Remnants of a
Yeah.
Separation. These two books are must read. Do you think these stories are powerful enough to bridge gap between India and Pakistan?
I hope so. But what I hope is that these stories, when people tell their stories within families, that it's not just the horror, the stories of horror, it's also that time as well. And I hope that in the individual kind of sphere, that those stories are remembered and passed on to the subsequent generations. I think that just the very fact of having these testimonies, their very existence, are important, because if you don't have them, then politicians on either side of whatever hue can politicize that generation, whereas these testimonies kind of are sometimes counter to current political narratives. So I would like to think that they do, and also when you hear the stories, and I know it's really difficult for people to go back to to India and Pakistan, but when people hear these stories, when people go back, if they're lucky enough to their former homes, they're always greeted like long lost family members. And I think that those personal connections do count. But I also think actually the third generation, who are really inquisitive now, fourth generation too, about their family histories, I think that maybe they have a different view on things and are open to the complexity of the legacy of partition. I hope so.
Yes, I think my generation of my generation people might take interest in these stories, because I think it's the stories of the grandparents and great grandparents, and how they came to India or Pakistan or went to the UK. My question to you, maybe the last question that we should and what are the challenges of oral history recording oral histories, except the challenge of breaking the silence that they had for years, for decades? What are the other challenges that you faced while recording these stories?
So as I say, I never approached people, because I felt that this is very traumatic history, and people who lived through it was at a time where there was no understanding of kind of post-traumatic disorders, and they would have had no counselling. And so if people chose to keep a silence, then I respected that. It's not for me to kind of ask people to speak. So often when we put our call out, it was grandchildren or children who said, I think my family members have a story. So firstly, I would say you have to approach very carefully. And I think that when you record oral history, I am a journalist, but I had an instinct that was the opposite of a journalist, honestly, that when people were telling me a story and were breaking down, I would say, stop if you want to, which often journalists don't always do. And so it was more important to me. I felt I had a duty of care to them, that if it was too much, they stop and they don't need to tell me the story, or I switch off my recording equipment, or I say, you don't need to tell me the story. So the duty of care to them in the telling of the story was the most important thing. it was important for me to do it in a setting that was their home, so they felt comfortable, and perhaps with a family member there. I left that to them. Again, I only spoke of what they wanted to. If they had any red lines of what they didn't want to talk to, I respected that. I think you also have to respect silence. And when I say silence, I don't mean their silence with partition, I mean pauses. There's something extraordinary that happens when people recount a history from very many years ago. You can almost see them visualizing the events. And sometimes you lose a person to that moment and they just don't speak for a couple of minutes. And I stopped talking myself. I only asked them a question once they drew breath again. And I think you have to sit in that silence. But I also think you have to acknowledge that these are memories 70 years on, and you have to be very upfront about that the memories 70 years on are not perfect. And so you have to have full disclosure of that. And then also, once I'd written my chapters, I always sent the chapters to my interviewees so that they actually could approve it or take out what they didn't like, or because I felt that this is their story. It was a privilege for me to hear. It's a privilege for me to tell. Even if they had said to me, I don't want my story told, I would have respected that. So at every bit of the way, they were with me, and not only them, but their children and their grandchildren too, because this was their story that I was telling, and I wanted to do it in the most respectful way. And there are times also where I could verify facts, and I always did try and verify facts. Or if I wasn't sure about things, I would say, but they couldn't remember this. Or if they would say a third person recounted this, I would be very upfront and say, this is not their memory, it's someone else's memory. So I think you have to be very upfront with your reader, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't not tell the story, if that makes sense.
Yes, and it would be very unfair to not mention the story of Kenneth Min.
Oh, yes.
If you can talk about him and his memories, being an outsider in India for a while, but then it was like his own land, which he still reminisces about. Can you talk about him?
Ken is Scottish, and his family were from Dundee. So Dundee was a place that a lot of people came to make jute. So they lived outside Calcutta in Meghna, and his father owned a jute mill. And he grew up with his ayah. He spoke Hindi first, and as was common in those days, you rarely saw his family. He spent most of his time with his ayah, and he would go fishing on the Hooghly, even though he was forbidden to do so by his parents. He would go out with the fishermen, and he witnessed terrible kind of murders in front of him when things got bad between fighting between Hindus and Muslims. And he said he himself never felt threatened. But and he also talks about fishing on the river with the Indian fishermen and seeing dead bodies in the river, and saying he was so used to it, it kind of didn't mean anything. It was so regular an event. And looking back, he said he can't believe he even had that thought as a child. It's a horrific thought to have. But he still, funnily enough, dreams in Hindi, and says by some kind of administrative error he is British. He feels a part of him is Indian. He actually even went back twice to live on the Indian subcontinent after his family came back. His family came back a couple of years after partition. But he feels a great, attachment to India, and I thought it important to mark those stories. Of course, the stories of the British were very, very different from South Asians, but for me, I was trying to show the connections between British people and South Asians in Britain. It was important for me to show those stories too.
Yeah, and where you mentioned there used to be meetings of the servants every day, every evening, of various communities coming together, and that suddenly stopped with the communal riots, and people were divided among themselves. That was truly heartbreaking. So thank you so much, Kavita, for taking out time to do this interview. It was truly an honor having you on our platform.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you so much. And are you planning on another book?
Yes, I'm updating this book for next year for the 75th anniversary with some new chapters.
That's amazing. So we look forward to that. And for our viewers, this book is available on Amazon, published by Bloomsbury India. You can check that book out and also get Anchal's book, Remnants of a Separation. Get both the books, read both of them, write to both the writers after you have written after you've read the books, and do share your reviews with Karwaan on our email address. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to having you again, Kavita.
All the best.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
And thanks so much, everybody, for joining in. We will meet again with another author with us on the Karwaan Conversation. Have a great evening ahead. Jai Hind.